All right. Hi, and welcome back to another edition of the Jacob and Jacob podcast. I'm your host, Jacob Kerr. I'm joined by my co-host, Jacob Roblom. And today we're joined by a very special guest, Dr. Joel Fish. Thank you for being on the show, Dr. Fish.
Pleasure to be here.
Dr. Fish is a nationally recognized sports psychologist. He's a psychologist consultant for the Philadelphia 76ers, Philadelphia Phillies, Philadelphia Flyers, the U.S. Women's National Field Hockey Team, and the U.S. Women's National Soccer Team. And on top of all that, he's a best-selling author. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Fish. We hope that you and your family are staying safe and doing well during these tough times.
Thank you, Jacob, and it's a pleasure to be here.
All right, let's get right into it. So, Dr. Fish, what drew you to this profession?
Well, that's a really good question, because I wish I could tell you guys I had this all mapped out, but I really didn't. Back in the late 70s, sports psychology was really a field that was just getting started. And I went to the University of Wisconsin in a psychology degree, and I had a chance to do all my internships or take a specialty, if you will, in sports psychology. I like sports. I like psychology. I said, why not? So that's how I really got started in the field. And then since that time, the field has really grown and mushroomed, and I've just been able to really just build my work in the sports psychology area. But it wasn't as well thought out as I would like to be able to tell you it was.
Why did you pick Wisconsin for school?
I got in, first of all. Let's be honest about that. My dad had gone to Wisconsin for undergraduate from 1938 to 1941. He was from Massachusetts, actually the Boston area. And I always grew up hearing about Wisconsin and listening about Wisconsin. And it had a big impact on his life. He had been an immigrant kid, and really it was a big part of his Americanization. So when I had a chance to go to Wisconsin, I really jumped at it because I felt like it was in my family history.
Thank you. So in sports psychology, how do you help athletes to gain the skills to be successful mentally, not just on the field, but also off the field?
Well, to explain what sports psychology is, there's two parts to it. And this is to answer your question. The sports part is what we'd call mental skills training. And I've asked hundreds, maybe thousands of athletes, all different sports. It could be baseball, basketball, golf, swimming, lacrosse. What percentage of sport is mental? What percentage of performance is mental? Confidence, composure, concentration, communication, teamwork. Athletes, no matter what the sport, no matter what the age, say sport is largely mental. So if the game's largely mental, the sport part of sports psychology is practicing mental skills to improve the mental part of the game. So that includes me teaching mental skills like positive self-talk, relaxation, focusing techniques, mental preparation, visualization. So that's the sport part of sports psychology. The psychology part is anything in a person's personal life that can be impacting on their performance. So I'm a licensed psychologist by background. I had a guy recently who came in and said, I'm in a slump. This was a baseball player. Well, in 5 minutes, we were talking about his mother, father, sister, brother. That was really more a psychology case. So sports psychology, to help a particular athlete, my step one for me is to assess, is this really a sport issue? Because I do believe as part of player development, we can get better building skills, confidence, composure, concentration, communication, teamwork. Or is it a mix of sport and psychology? Because if there's some underlying issue that's really affecting somebody's performance, you can teach some mental skills, but until you get to sort of the underlying issue, it's like putting a Band-Aid on a problem. So long-winded answer to your question, but for me to help an athlete, I have to assess how much is sport, how much psychology, then we develop a plan from there.
So would you say athletes often deal with similar problems? Like when you deal with patients, would you say there's often like similar problems, or do you see a lot of variations?
Well, interesting to me, I mean, I've had a chance to work at the professional level, the Olympic level, college, high school, sport-related issues, non-sport. A lot of the times the issues are really the same. Like a lot of times if you boil it down, it's going to come down to confidence, just like it might for you in school, just like it might for me in doing a presentation. The difference is that at the pro level, at the elite level, they're under a bigger microscope, so more people are watching it. But confidence is a core issue, I would suggest, in a lot of what I deal with. And same thing with composure, how to learn to control your emotions rather than your emotions controlling you. You and I might have that same conversation as it relates to test taking, because maybe there's a pattern, 5 minutes left in the exam, your mind starts to get all clouded and it freezes. Well, at some level, that's the same thing that can happen to an athlete. Game's on the line, first down, 2 yards to go for a touchdown. In both cases, student, sport, you have to learn, in my opinion, to learn how to stay composed.
Hey.
Slow down like I'm doing with you right now. Be the calm in the midst of the storm. So even after all these years, it's really interesting to me how much athletes and non-athletes and elite athletes and high school athletes really have in common. There's more in common in many ways than there are differences.
So keeping with the mental side of sports right now, how do you think athletes, with all the uncertainty going around in their respective sports, are going to be able to mentally come back from this?
With all the
Uncertainty that they're going through right now?
No, that's a great question. I think we're all dealing with so much disruption, you, me,
Yeah.
athletes, I would suggest probably more than non-athletes, major generalization, are creatures of habit. So when you're in season, you've got a really clear routine. We practice at a certain time, we play at a certain time, we rest at a certain time, we eat at a certain time. So I just think it's been really hard for many athletes, it's been hard for all of us, because their routine is just so disrupted. And then interestingly enough for me, from my perspective, is the rhythm of the family life has really been disrupted. So you have some athletes who might have a significant other, they might have kids, and typically if they're basketball, hockey, this time of the year, they're away, they're home, they're away, they're home. Well, now they're home 24/7. Baseball, same thing. They might be away for 2 weeks, then they're home. So part of how they're going to cope with it is how they're coping in the moment with some of the changes that they have to go through. Have to develop new routines, have to work out family issues. And the same as all of us, like by week 10 of this pandemic, it might feel different than week 9 or 8 or 7. I think we're all learning how to deal with different feelings related to frustration, impatience, boredom. And like us, unfortunately, some of the athletes have a parent who may be sick or a grandparent or someone who's at risk. So a lot of their adjustment is similar to ours, but because they're such creatures of habit, I think there's a different layer sometimes. And because the rhythm of their year is so different, there's a different layer of adjustment that many of us have to go through.
Thank you. So one thing that's being discussed very frequently is that if games are to return this summer, that it seems increasingly likely that there's not going to be fans in attendance. How do you think that would affect the athletes? Do you think it would be a positive effect or a negative effect in their sort of mental state?
I think that it's going to be very similar in some ways and clearly different in some ways. You guys play sports, I play sports, in the sense of these guys are, and women are really competitors. And at the heat of the moment, when there's a game going on, it's the competitive urge that really takes over. So whether you've played at Barrack or I've played in a weekend league, like at that moment, that game can seem really important. And if you're a competitor, it's going to come out, and there's nobody watching more often than not. So you don't get to be at the elite level, at the pro level, unless you're awfully competitive. It takes talent, it takes competitiveness, takes a lot of luck. But because these men and women are so competitive, I think when those games start and there's nobody in the fans, it's still going to be very competitive because that's the part of their personality that's going to come out. Having said that, human nature, adrenaline gets connected to cheering and booing and fans, and it's not an accident that most teams have better home records than they do away records, particularly in sports like basketball. It's significant. And I think part of that has to do, yes, they're familiar with the court, they're familiar with the environment, but I do believe there's an extra 3 or 5% of adrenaline that comes from fans either cheering for you, booing for you, but just the energy that's in the stadium. Some guys are affected more by that than others. So I think competitiveness is going to work. For most guys, it's going to take over. Will there be a difference, though? Yes. And it's that 3 or 5% that comes with that adrenaline rush.
Thank you.
So during this downtime, ESPN put out a documentary titled The Last Dance about Michael Jordan, and we get to see a lot of Michael's killer instinct. And Michael, who's the greatest of all time, expected his teammates to work at the same level he did. Do you think that was really fair of Michael, or was this the formula that won the Bulls 6 championships?
I think that what I've seen, and I think it's an unbelievable documentary, is even among the pros, there's different levels of competitiveness. And the superstars, the Michael Jordans, the LeBron James, the Wayne Gretzky's, the Julius Irvings. I mean, these guys are Tom Brady. They're a 1 in a million talent, and they're a 1 in a million personality too. So even at the pro level, this documentary has shown to me like he is an elite of the elite in terms of competitiveness. And I think that's come out in this. Because he had the talent to match it, that's what makes him a superstar, 1 in a million talent, 1 in a million personality. And when you're able to back it up, walk the walk, talk the talk, credibility, then I think you're able to try to motivate guys to come up to your level. And I think, particularly in this last episode where he came back after playing baseball and now is trying to repeat again, it really feels like his competitiveness was ratcheted up even another notch. And I do think that when you can back it up and when you practice what you preach, it gives you license to be able to motivate guys through tough love. If you don't have the credibility, if you're not practicing what you preach, if the guys deep down inside don't feel like, you know what, he's really doing it for my benefit, he thinks this is the best way to make me a better player, then I don't think that tough love kind of approach works. I think most players see through that pretty quickly, and it can be very divisive in a locker room. I think there was a check and balance, though, with Phil Jackson, and who had a way to check and balance on the environment there, on the coaching environment. So I think it's fair because he had the extraordinary personality, he had the extraordinary talent, he had the extraordinary track record. And so he was able to practice that kind of tough love approach because he had the credibility.
And sort of to follow up on that, Michael Jordan, obviously, as we just talked about, put a lot of pressure on his teammates. And we don't see as much of that in sports today. It still obviously exists, but maybe not to that extent as to what Michael Jordan did. Do you think athletes would sort of react differently? Do you think it would have a more negative effect on them if they sort of experienced that today from another teammate?
Well, I do think the norms were really different. I think back when he played in the 90s and the 80s, the role of the coach was different and the role of the authority figure was different. There wasn't as much questioning of what the coach did or what the top player did. I think tough love was a little more in vogue then than it is now. And in a good way, I believe that since then, there's been a greater understanding of the importance of players having different personality types and that you motivate different guys in a different way. I think that there's a greater understanding that if you want to get performance, part of player development is having resources for the strength and conditioning, nutrition, sports psychology. Like guys like me, when I was starting out, was like the exception rather than the rule. Now every team has somebody like me on them, at least at the pro level. And so I don't think you could just go with a tough love approach anymore. I think you need to have a more well-rounded approach. And I think that's a good thing because not all pro athletes are clones of each other. Some guys you need to put their arm around them to motivate them. Some guys you can challenge them. Sometimes you can get in their face. But I think there's an understanding that one size doesn't fit all, if you will, in terms of motivation and in terms of getting people to perform their best. Same thing on the women's side. And I think that's been a good development for sport in general. It from the pro level all the way down to high school, that there's an understanding that there needs to be different approaches on how to build teams, how to build a team culture, how to motivate players.
So, sticking with The Last Dance, former Bulls point guard and now current Warriors head coach Steve Kerr said that he was scared to death of MJ. Do you think that playing with MJ shaped Kerr into the great head coach that he is today, or was Kerr just born to be a great head coach?
Well, I think to get to the pro level, you have to have a certain amount of mental toughness. And mental toughness is the ability to play under pressure. Because to get to the pro level, you have to have an extraordinary talent, but an extraordinary personality. So if Steve Kerr couldn't have handled the kind of pressure that Michael Jordan put him under, chances are he wouldn't have made it to the NBA. Or nowadays, they would have someone like me or someone else to help Steve Kerr learn some of the mental skills necessary to deal with somebody like Michael Jordan. So my hunch is he came to that level already with a high level of what we call mental toughness. I've read a little bit about his background. His dad was a college president. He's a very well-educated guy. I'm sure those skills helped him to not only get to the NBA level, but stay there or learn how to take some criticism from Michael Jordan and channel it into improving. So my hunch is that he's probably borrowed a little bit of that, but a little bit of other parts of his upbringing also. And maybe he's learned from Michael Jordan to do certain things in the same way. Maybe he learned from Michael Jordan to do certain things in another way too. I think when we're on a team and just, we learn through modeling and imitation. And sometimes we want to imitate what we've been through. And sometimes from what we learn, we say, you know what, I don't want to imitate that. I want to do it a different way. So he probably gained some things that he's continued doing with Golden State as a head coach, but I bet he's done some things different directly related to that experience of working with Michael Jordan. And just to add to that too, I think part of what I've gotten from that documentary is how exceptional a coach Phil Jackson was. In my world, there's one set of coaching skills to attain success, and there's another set to keep it, to sustain it. And I don't think oftentimes he's given enough credit for how talented a coach you have to be when you have superstars on your team. Like a lot of times I've heard, oh, he had the best players, that's why he won. But for him to have that run in Chicago, and then for Phil Jackson to have that same run in Los Angeles, Kobe Bryant, Shaquille O'Neal, I've been really impressed with his talent as a coach. And I just think that we can't underestimate the importance of having him as a coach in terms of the results that the Bulls produce and that the Lakers produce.
Thank you. And jumping back to sort of sports today, away from the documentary, obviously the NHL and the NBA and the MLB are not playing right now, and they're on hold. Do you think it's necessary that there's some sort of training camp for the players before returning into action to allow them to get back into the shape they need to be in order to perform at the top level?
I do. And again, I'm going to look at it from my angle, which is the mental part. And I think that spring training camp is necessary for guys to physically get back in shape, women too, but also mentally to get back in shape. There's just a high level of focus and stress and preparation mentally that's required to play that number of games at the highest level. Like, you just can't go from the street to playing at that level day after day after day if you're playing baseball, or every other day with basketball. So spring training, from my experience working with pro teams, is a time for players to physically get ready, but also mentally to get ready. And I think particularly in this environment where they're just like we are, there's been anxiety, there's fear, there's some guys that are more confident in coming back under these conditions. There's other guys that are going to be more fearful. I just think it's actually doubly important for them to have a transition period going from lockdown at home to playing a game. So whatever emerges, and I don't have a crystal ball, I don't know if there are going to be games or not, but if there are, I am sure there's going to be a 2-3 week preparation period, call it spring training camp, not only to get these guys ready physically and women, but also mentally.
So for the younger players who are getting this time off, how do you think that's going to affect them in their young careers and they're in the early learning stages of their pro league?
Well, I think my angle is always, what can we learn from this experience that could help us down the road? And I just think there's opportunity for younger athletes and adult athletes to spend time working on mental skills. There's some great apps out there. For example, these have been endorsed by the NBA. Calm, maybe you saw LeBron James in these commercials, or Headspace, endorsed by the NBA, where there are exercises to learn how to relax, slow down, mindfulness, things I'm just doing with you right now. What a great opportunity we have, you and I, to learn some mental skills around patience, how to deal with frustration, be a self-starter. Like if we can set goals to improve in those areas, win the day. What does it mean to stay focused today, even though you might not have an assignment for 2-3 weeks, you might be having online learning, and really stick to your plan? Like that's a life skill, but it's also a sports skill too. Why I love sports psychology is everything we've talked about so far: confidence, composure, concentration, communication. They may help you to perform. But why I really like sports psychology, those are the same skills that are going to help you in school. They're going to help you in a relationship. They're going to help you in a job. It becomes an arena to teach life skills. So I'm not naive. I feel frustrated too. Different. Who knows what's going to happen? If we knew it was going to end July 1st, it would be easier to cope with, but we don't. So let's try to figure out how we can learn, how we can improve. And I do believe there's opportunities in some of those areas that I mentioned. Reminds me, the way I work with injured athletes too. Like injured athletes all of a sudden aren't able to compete. Okay, let's take a look at what you're going through, and is there something you have an opportunity to learn that when you're playing you may not? Sitting on the bench, looking at the game a different way, patience, one day at a time, control what you can, let go what you can't. Like this is the mental process that injured athletes have to go through. And I've been thinking about that because there's a similar, what can we learn from what we're going through, that I think could be really valuable time for you sport athletes.
And one more thing, a lot of NFL teams have said that they are planning on having sort of virtual offseason sessions. Do you think that helps the players sort of ease back into the flow of things?
I do, because I think it approximates what training camp would be. Clearly, it's not the same as being there. And what I keep learning, I'll use a word that I used before, we're not all clones of each other, different personality traits. So some of us are more able to self-start than others. Like some players, some people are deadline people. Until it gets to the last week, they're not going to be able to perform. Some guys need a coach, a teacher, a parent to be over their shoulder in order to hold them accountable, if you will. 90% of decisions we make in our life in general, nobody's looking over our shoulders. Like we just decide what to wear in the morning kind of thing. And so for the players that are still learning, player development to me is about learning how to be better self-starters. I think virtual workouts and virtual learning has been a lot harder because you don't have the structure, the routine, the accountability in the same way as you would live. Great opportunity to learn more self-accountability. But I do think for those players, getting back to the NFL question, who really thrive more when they are being accountable by a coach, a teammate, I think they're going to have the biggest adjustment coming back and catching up to everybody else, because those are the players who I think were at risk to fall behind in this virtual setup.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Fish. We really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us.
You guys asked really good questions. I want you to know that. You really did. And I appreciated your preparation and your thoughtfulness. And I hope this gave you some things to think about.
Yeah. Thank you so much again.
And we'll do it again sometime if you'd like.
Yeah, of course. Welcome back anytime.
Yeah. Well, let me know when you send a link when you're done with this. I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, of course.
So pass it along.
Thank you.